Little Nightmares is weird. That was my first impression when I finally got around to trying it back in the hell year 2020. I thought the art style was unique and the world intriguing, but my feeble mind was slow and stubborn and gunked up by a lockdown diet of snacks and misery. I saw strangeness for its own sake, until the moment I made an unexpected friend. This big old shoe. And though the cruel rigidity of a developer's designs cut short the adventures of Six and Shuey, that unfortunate footwear left a lasting impression, not unlike a footprint on my squishy human brain. Little Nightmares isn't weird at all. It's a surrealist work of genius. Here's why. Truth be told, what made that moment, and by extension the rest of the game, stick with me had less to do with the shoe itself and far more to do with the world at large. It's an often cavernous, often claustrophobic place to inhabit, as Six flits between cracks and crevices like a frightened rat and passes through rooms both broad and dark that appear ready to swallow her whole. And while the malformed humanoids encountered along the way were intimidating in isolation, it was the mundane that I found most disconcerting. Because with the mundane there comes an implication. Old Shuey was just the moment it clicked. That for every gargantuan pair of wingtips there's a creature big enough to fill them. For every enormous suitcase there's something big enough to carry it. And for every shelf that looms like a skyscraper before Six, a being exists who fills it with frivolous things that are often larger than she is. These towering monsters are the norm, and the world belongs to them. But what does this mean for the story or for the character, and why does it matter? To unpack that, we need to take a step back from the game itself for a moment and check in with its creators, and then to understand a bit about surrealist art as a whole. Prior to the game's release, the minds behind Little Nightmares typically kept their cards close to their chests, though in one interview, Andreas Johnson and Dave Mervick did let slip this piece of illuminating information.
The whole idea, like Dave said during the presentation, is to emphasize or personify the kind of visions or how children would see things, and let us re-experience it as players. That is really important to us. That to kind of show what she sees, basically. Yeah.
It's real to her then.
It's definitely real to her, but it is kind of in between.
Through this, we have solid confirmation that there's some sort of distinction between objective reality and the version of events we witness through Six's journey, though the line between the two is intentionally hazy, to the point of being impossible to discern. It stands to reason then that the oversized nature of the game's environments and its bizarre monsters are, at least to an extent, the product of a child's imagination. They are manifestations of how someone smaller, younger, and lacking in understanding might interpret a world much bigger and more complex than they can comprehend. So that means it's just all in our head and none of it matters, right? No, and anyone who thinks that is wrong and should probably feel bad. Let's talk about art for a second. When it comes to surrealist art, we can divide artistic works into two kinds: veristic surrealism and automatic surrealism. Veristic surrealism is what most of us typically envision, with the works of Salvador Dali being the most obvious example. Veristic deals primarily with interpreting dreams, or unconscious associations between things like images, text and such, the idea being that the content of such dreams and the context of these associations are expressions of the subconscious. So, in essence, the art itself becomes a form of exploring and expressing unconscious feelings or desires. This is all well and good if you're intending to put brush to canvas, but for the purposes of our discussion, it's the other kind we're more interested in. Automatic surrealism is somewhat self-explanatory, in that, by nature, it's spontaneous, it's unplanned, and created without conscious thought. In typical art circles, this would include stream of consciousness writing, automatic drawings, paintings, and the like, with one example given in this article by Curated Taste being the absent-minded doodling people do while talking on the phone. So we can sort of think of it as art that happens incidentally. However, in psychological terms, automatism refers to involuntary actions and processes, ones not under the control of the conscious mind, so stuff like dreaming, breathing, blinking and so on. By this definition, I feel the imagination of a child is undeniably automatic, and could perhaps qualify as the purest form of automatic surrealism there is, even if the results aren't ever put on paper or cast in stone. Imaginings are created spontaneously, without conscious thought, and express unconscious feelings and desires, after all. Now, of course, in the case of Little Nightmares, the game itself was not automatic. It was created with deliberate care and attention. It was, I believe, crafted with this automatic principle in mind, however, in that what we're seeing on screen is intended to be the world informed by Six's unconscious interpretation. And informed is a key term here, because what we witness as players isn't a meaningless fantasy, but rather an augmented form of the reality in which Little Nightmares takes place. In effect, we're living through Six's personal work of automatic surrealism, but one where her reality serves as its foundation. And though I'm sure many will disagree with this, in my opinion, telling a story or exploring a character in a surreal way can often be more meaningful than sticking to the strictly literal. I feel this way because surrealism was, by design, intended to unearth the superior reality of the subconscious. So what exactly is it about the subconscious that makes its reality superior? I'm sure that's open to debate, but sticking with Little Nightmares as our example, to me it's that the representation we get of what Six goes through, the one with misshapen pursuers and mountainous clutter, more accurately conveys her personal journey than a realistic interpretation ever could. To dig into that just for a moment, I think it's safe to say that most people who watch this video will be teenagers or older, and so regardless of how true or false the version of events we witness is, seeing a regular looking adult chase a kid in a raincoat through an everyday environment is never going to instill in us the level of fear and dread it would in the child themselves. Each of the basic components that make up the realistic scenario are too familiar to us to fully represent what Six is going through. This long-limbed gentleman, however, solves that problem in the grossest possible way. Sure, a realistic interpretation can absolutely instill the intended feelings to an extent, but what it will always lack is that amplification that comes with a child's perspective, the patchwork of larger-than-life fantasy that unwittingly fills their gaps in understanding. By virtue of this, I would argue that whilst we might consider something like Little Nightmares to be less real than something more grounded in our observable reality, it in fact contains more truth than the alternative would. The story then isn't rendered meaningless by abstraction, but rather its impact is enhanced by it, because the threats faced along the way do exist, and their warped presentation more honestly depicts their nature. The world we traverse is absolutely one worth being afraid of, and its exaggerated scale is a truer representation of the scale of the challenge for our tiny, hooded hero. Now, all this is cool, at least in my opinion, but Little Nightmares doesn't have a monopoly on surrealism. There's plenty of other stuff out there that uses the abstract and the non-literal to tell stories. Through the course of my first playthrough though, there was another moment that elevated the game beyond most comparable works for me. Now I have thousands of shoe friends, was my first thought, obviously, but that was quickly replaced by something less stupid. The imagery we see here is undeniably evocative, and will likely bring to mind one of history's most tragic events for anyone with even a passing knowledge of World War II. So the question I had to ask myself at this point was, if the spooky giants can do this to me, then what happened to the owners of all these? And just like that, I was inventing theories, filling in the gaps in my own understanding with all manner of imagined creatures and conjuring possible means and motives with very little of substance to base them on. I finished the game in a matter of hours, but in the months since, Little Nightmares has changed shape in my thoughts 1,000 times, often without conscious thought, having crept into my brain without warning yet again. The intentionally blank spaces and unanswered questions are fertile ground for childish imaginings. And through the act of creating our own explanations, we can connect with Six in a way very few things could hope to emulate, by concocting nightmares of our own, whether we want to or not.